Hi, sleeping for hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos. Imagine a city that learns to sleep with one ear open. Snow piles against curbs, the L rattles in the distance, and a quiet man walks past a diner window. People don't stop him for autographs. They barely notice he's there. Yet doors open, phones go silent, and conversations change course as he passes. He doesn't boast. He doesn't need to. He's not a movie version of a boss with flashy suits and loud speeches. He's the opposite. Soft voice, still face, careful steps. His name is Tony Accardo. Newspapers will later crown him with nicknames, but the people who paid attention learned something more plain and more unsettling. In a world that prized noise, his power came from silence. This is not to celebrate him. It's to understand how someone so outwardly ordinary could bend a city's hidden economy, how he kept his freedom when bolder men fell, and how the choices he made sent long ripples through families, union halls, studios, casinos, and neighborhoods. If you listen for a minute, you'll hear the wind on a dark Chicago block, and a lesson about influence. It doesn't always move like thunder. Sometimes, it moves like snow. He entered life in a hard corner of Chicago, in a small apartment where the hallway smelled of cooked onions and coal. His parents, immigrants chasing steadier days, believed in long work and few words. As a boy, Tony learned to read faces before he learned to read the paper. School didn't hold him long. Money mattered more. He ran errands, shined shoes, and kept his eyes open. On those streets, small errands turned into small scams, and small scams brushed against boys with older friends who spoke of easy cash and quick ways to settle disputes. He fell in with a group the city knew as the 42, a street crew that mixed mischief with petty crime. They were not the top of anything, but they were a pipeline. Older men noticed which kids ran when things got loud, and which kids stayed calm. Tony stayed calm. Prohibition turned Chicago into a marketplace where liquor flowed through alleys, back rooms, and hidden doors. Clubs hummed with bands and laughter, and behind that stage light stood men who coordinated supplies, payoffs, and protection. Tony's quiet caught the ear of people tied to Al Capone's world. He ran messages at first, simple tasks that tested whether he could be trusted to carry instructions without asking questions. He delivered envelopes. He drove a car where and when told. He kept his mouth shut. Step by step, he moved from errand boy to dependable hand. In a time when violence lurked in many corners, he learned to survive by preparing more than talking, watching more than boasting. The outfit, as Chicago's syndicate became known, blended bootlegging, gambling, and a patchwork of rackets into an engine that paid off aldermen, bent rules, and neutralized rivals. Tony was not the public showman. He was the man who did not flinch. Stories passed around give him a blunt nickname coming from Capone himself after a brutal episode. The exact details aren't needed here. What matters is the impression he left on his superiors. This was someone who would do what he was told, swiftly and without drawing attention. In that world, reliability trumped volume. He rose because he didn't treat orders as performances. Chicago's bloodiest headlines, the ones the tabloids still print for anniversaries, came and went, and Tony's name rarely appeared beside them. He wasn't known for improvised chaos. He was known for discipline. When Capone was brought down for tax crimes and sent away, the outfit had to evolve. Frank Nitti took a larger role, and the machine reorganized under men who preferred smoother gears over theatrical noise. Tony found mentors in that moment, men like Paul Ricca, who valued planning over flash. He learned that power was safer when it looked like patience. With Prohibition's end, easy liquor profits faded, but the syndicate did not. It shifted quickly into gambling, extortion, and control of services that touched everyday life. Slot machines and dice games, bookmakers handling horse races and later sports, the numbers racket in working-class neighborhoods, protection fees wrapped around taverns and trucking. All of it needed someone to coordinate who paid, who collected, and who spoke to officials when questions came. Tony excelled at that kind of coordination. He didn't need newspapers to know it. The men who owed and the men who collected understood it every week. During the early 1930s, police pulled him in now and then on suspicion or for questioning. The charges rarely stuck. He left stations with a blank face and a lawyer at his side. The pattern mattered. Build money, limit attention, cultivate friendly faces in city departments, and never give a speech when a nod will do. Through the decade, the outfit pursued a foothold beyond neighborhood taverns. They saw that unions moved goods, and that movie sets generated payrolls. They targeted labor racketeering, controlling who led certain locals, then using that leverage to squeeze owners for cash under the pretense of labor peace. That approach reached all the way to Hollywood, where studios faced threats of strikes or disruptions unless they paid. Nitty's circle oversaw that shift. When indictments came, when pressure mounted, and when Nicky died by his own hand rather than face prison, the outfit needed stability. Rika and other senior figures took more control. Tony's stock rose again. By the mid-1940s, while some leaders were sent away or restricted, Tony was the loyal executor who kept the cash moving. The outfit adjusted after federal prosecutions weighed on the Hollywood scheme. It consolidated gambling in suburban towns and friendly municipalities, especially in places like Cicero, where local officials proved pliable. Illegal casinos sprang behind legitimate fronts, back rooms of restaurants, daytime social clubs that transformed after sunset. The games were not new, but the scale was. Tony's contribution was as an organizer who modernized collections and reinvested profits. He pushed for greater control of bookmaking by dominating the flow of racing information. In those days, wire services transmitted results and odds to bookmakers. Controlling that wire meant controlling the lifeblood of gambling. The outfit muscled into that pipeline, and one prominent independent operator who resisted suffered attempts on his life before dying under disputed circumstances. Law enforcement and newspapers suspected outfit hands steering events. Courtroom proof was murky in parts, but the result was unmistakable. Syndicate influence over the wire service grew, and with it the size of the gambling economy under their thumb. As revenue swelled, Tony encouraged the purchase of legitimate businesses, bakeries, car dealerships, laundries, construction outfits. Some served as real investments, some served as safe containers to mix clean cash with dirty streams. This was the method of a man who preferred stability over spectacle. He also started living more comfortably. He moved his family to a leafy suburb, kept a neat house, and tried to look like another successful businessman. Neighbors saw a courteous man watering his lawn, not the weight behind a regional racket. He enjoyed fishing. A newspaper photo of him with a massive catch in the early 1950s produced the nickname Big Tuna, a label he didn't ask for and didn't particularly like, but one the press loved to repeat. The federal government, embarrassed by how long organized crime had thrived, launched broader inquiries. The Kefauver hearings in the early 1950s brought TV cameras into living rooms, showcasing mob figures across the country. Tony was summoned, and like many others, invoked his right against self-incrimination again and again. He gave nothing away. On paper, he was a businessman. In life, he was the careful keeper of a machine that took in money from illegal casinos, bookmaking, loan sharking that trapped debtors with crushing interest, extortion that kept bars and trucking lines paying, and the quiet takeover of union locals whose leaders could be influenced through threats or payoffs. Through all of this, he cultivated the appearance of a suburban family man. He did not dine in celebrity restaurants like some younger figures would later do. He stayed low. His rise to the top was gradual in public view and decisive inside the outfit. After Rika's legal troubles, Tony became the operational head. One could call him boss, but labels in that world hid more than they revealed. He preferred roles that allowed him to steer without being seen steering. He set policy, tighten discipline, punish rogue side deals, avoid heat, and keep friendly lawyers on retainer. He disliked the spotlight and preferred that younger men do the day-to-day posturing as front bosses. Within the outfit, his word became the last word. Under Tony's approach, the outfit expanded reach without waving flags. The policy racket kept bringing in daily cash from neighborhoods where working families placed tiny bets on three-digit numbers. Bookies settled up in coffee shops and back booths. Slot machines moved in and out of bars depending on which city inspectors were on duty. Loan sharking spread in the shadows around union halls and small businesses. A bar owner who fell behind on rent could get money fast and then find himself tethered for years. Strip clubs and brothels were controlled through middlemen. No one of these streams made the empire. Together they made the empire dependable. The outfit paid protection up and down, from patrol officers to local functionaries, while trying to avoid the kind of bloody public warfare that had burned the city's reputation in the Capone years. His talent, if we can call it that without praising the harm it enabled, was organization. He kept books in ways that were hard to trace. He rotated fronts. He preferred plausible distance from acts that might place him at a scene. He also enforced internal rules. Skimming by subordinates, taking a personal slice before passing up the proper share, led to quiet, harsh consequences. Descriptions of those consequences have filled many books. We don't need the gore here to understand the message. Inside the outfit, consistency was enforced by fear. Law enforcement continued to push. Tony faced tax questions among other probes. At times, indictments landed. Appeals and legal maneuvers followed. He had excellent counsel. He developed a reputation for beating cases either in court or before trial. Across decades, he avoided the long prison terms that defined the fall of many contemporaries. That was not luck. It was design born of caution. Live quietly, say less, spend cash through clean conduits, and leave as few fingerprints as possible, literal or figurative. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, while boss in practice, he began preparing a new front line for the future. He recognized promise in younger men, some from the same street pipeline that had fed him. One of those was Sam Giancana, a sharp, ambitious operator with a taste for spotlight Tony never shared. The plan in time would be simple. Let someone else deal with reporters and local fame. Let someone else become the face. Tony would remain the constant, the counselor, the chairman, in all but title, guarding tradition and profit. Before that moment fully arrived, he kept building the outfit's footprint outside Illinois. The syndicate forged partnerships with other Midwestern cities, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and explored interests in Florida and California. Chicago's share in Las Vegas grew through fronts and partnerships that leveraged Teamsters' pension loans to finance hotels and casinos. These arrangements did not appear out of thin air. They came through years of meetings, intermediaries, and a patient appetite for a slice of every table's drop. The simple summary is this: as legal gambling rose in the desert, illegal skimming rose behind the cashier cages, and Chicago wanted its percentage. Yet even as money grew, Tony held to discipline. He did not allow public sprees that would spook the city or Washington. He valued predictability over drama. He preferred cash to glory. He understood that not drawing attention was itself a form of armor. He played long games with city politics, with contractors, with trucking routes, with the quiet placement of trusted people in sensitive spots. It was a web rather than a ladder. People who lived near him describe a man who rarely raised his voice, who tipped well, who appeared as an ordinary neighbor. People who crossed him describe the opposite, the invisible pressure that arrived without warning. Both can be true. He compartmentalized his life so well that even some acquaintances, years later, couldn't reconcile the polite suburban figure with the ruthless strategist of Chicago's underworld. That duality, sustained for decades, is the heart of his story. By the middle of the 1950s, with the Big Tuna nickname attached by smiling headline writers and the outfit's businesses humming, Tony looked for someone to take the chair at the front of the table while he took the chair at the back. He would sit farther from the lights, but he would sit higher in the room. The men around him understood what that meant. It meant rules would be followed. It meant side hustles needed approval. It meant that, if politicians shifted, the outfit would shift before them. And it meant that the quiet man from a cramped apartment had become the steady hand guiding a multi-state criminal conglomerate. None of this should be mistaken for glamour. The crimes he oversaw, bookmaking, illegal casinos, extortion of businesses, control of unions for private profit, loans that ruined borrowers, brothels that exploited women, skimming that diverted millions, and acts of intimidation that silenced witnesses, hurt people and communities. They warped markets and undermined trust in civic life. The reason to recount them is to understand their shape and their lessons. Criminal power often avoids loud colors. It lives in routines, in ownership papers, in envelopes and favors, and in the intimidation that never needs to be spoken aloud. By the end of this phase of his life, Tony had built what he wanted: wealth, insulation, and a structure that let others take the public heat while he kept control. He had outlasted the end of Prohibition, outmaneuvered early federal campaigns, and retooled a battered syndicate into a quieter, broader, richer machine. Ahead lay a new era with a flashier frontman who would pull celebrities into his orbit, flirt with politics, and draw television cameras back to Chicago. Tony would watch all that from a short distance, intervening when needed, reminding everyone that the point was not fame. The point was control, and control hates noise. The city's winter deepened, the horn of a distant train faded, and inside a tidy suburban home a man polished his shoes and reviewed the next week's orders in his head. He did not plan to be a legend. He planned to stay free, and for a very long time he did. The handoff did not happen with banners or speeches. It arrived as a mood change around the table, a new seating chart, a few different phone numbers for key people, and a quiet understanding that a younger, louder figure would take the public-facing role. Sam Giancana liked attention, liked the night air of clubs, liked the feeling that comes when everyone in a room knows you are the center of it. Tony watched that taste for noise with a mixture of caution and calculation. If someone else drew the lights would stay off him. That arrangement suited him, so long as rules held. Chicago moved through the late 1950s under a thin layer of order. A new mayor promised reform. Inspectors did rounds. Headlines told residents that vice was being pushed back. The truth was a shuffle. The outfit adapted to the mayor's priorities, moved machines when it made sense, opened a room 2 towns over, shifted sports books to apartments instead of storefronts, and met oversight with bland smiles. Cicero hummed as always, a dependable satellite where judges and license boards were friendlier. Tony's approach, now as the senior voice behind the curtain, stressed stability. He wanted consistent numbers, fewer surprises, and quiet growth into areas that seemed dull to outsiders but paid every week. Coin-operated routes, vending, waste hauling, delivery contracts, warehouses near rail yards. In 1957, a gathering of mob bosses in upstate New York turned into a roundup that stained reputations and filled papers nationwide. Chicago's top men were conspicuously absent. That was not luck. Tony had no taste for ceremonies. He believed that putting dozens of powerful men on a back road together invited fate. While other cities had to explain fleeing into woods in expensive shoes, Chicago's leadership went about their business at home, reinforcing a lesson Tony kept teaching: only a fool craves the spotlight when he does not own the camera. The national government did not forget Chicago just because Chicago skipped one meeting. Senate hearings on labor racketeering dug into how union treasuries were used as leverage, how strikes could start or end based on envelopes rather than grievances, and how pension funds were becoming banks for people who never set foot in a plant. Jimmy Hoffa's rise to the top of the Teamsters put him on a collision course with the Justice Department, and it also put him in orbit with Chicago's emissaries. In those years, money from the Central States Pension Fund flowed west to projects that needed large loans. Hotels and casinos in Nevada, and some real estate deals in California, found financing there. The structure was complicated, with corporations on paper, layers of local intermediaries, and legitimate managers. Behind it, familiar figures expected a share off the top, an arrangement that would grow larger in the decade ahead. Tony did not handle every call to Reno or Las Vegas. He set guardrails, selected trusted lieutenants, and approved partnerships. One fixer based on the West Coast smoothed introductions to film people and later to casino owners. Another liaison handled union matters, reading the temperature of locals that controlled freight or construction crews. A third man, soft-spoken and famous among agents for never raising his voice, cultivated political contacts in city halls and state capitals. This board of directors model fit Tony's temperament. He did not need to be in every picture to decide which pictures would exist. Giancana's style often contradicted that caution. He liked to be seen at tables with entertainers. He enjoyed being mentioned in columns. He dated a singer whose fame made gossip pages hum. He visited a Tahoe resort where a crooner held a stake, and his presence there drew reporters and regulators. Nevada's gaming control authorities kept lists of people they wanted nowhere near the counting rooms. When photographs surfaced and whispers about certain guests circulated, those lists grew. A well-known performer lost his license after regulators concluded that the company he fronted had hosted banned company. In Tony's world, that kind of incident violated the essential rule: don't risk income for vanity. He made his displeasure known in the way he always did, not with a public outburst, but with a tightening of expectations and a reminder that the chair at the head of the table could be pulled back at any time. Federal pressure intensified with a new administration in Washington. The president's brother, as Attorney General, targeted organized crime with an energy that unsettled old habits. Wiretaps went up, grand juries met, subpoenas landed, and a generation of mid-level figures were hauled in to answer questions. Some answered nothing and went to jail on contempt charges. Some talked around questions and bought time. A few tried to cut deals. Tony, as usual, avoided the room entirely by keeping his hands off daily operational details that could put him within reach. When investigators tried to make a tax case against him, he hired the best counsel he could find. A prosecution did win a verdict against him at one point, but years of appeals followed, and an appellate court later tossed the conviction. To outside observers, it looked like magic. Inside his circle, it was called discipline. Keep finances indirect. keep assets in others' names, keep paperwork clean enough to create doubt. The outfit's gambling business reached into every neighborhood. Corner bars hosted small cards in the back, then packed everything into a locked cabinet when a friendly warning came across the phone. Italian social clubs offered juice loans at interest rates that would break almost anyone, using neighborhood ties to keep people paying. Bookmakers conducted business in barbershops and diners at off hours. The syndicate controlled the flow of racing information that fed those operations. After the independent wire service operator who had challenged Chicago died in a hospital following an earlier attack, control of the racing wire consolidated into hands amenable to the outfit and its partners. Daily sheets moved with smooth regularity, and with them a steady river of cash. Labor racketeering remained a core strategy. It was not flamboyant like a casino floor, but it reached deeper into the economy. A union local that handled gates at a convention center could make a show open on time or not. A local that ran deliveries could add a fee that every vendor swallowed to keep goods moving. Construction crews meant permits and inspections, and if certain contractors always seemed to pass inspections, there were reasons for that. City contracts and airport work turned into opportunities. O'Hare grew in the early 1960s, a massive hub that demanded cement, steel, trucking, food service, maintenance. Companies tied by marriage or friendship to outfit men won subcontracts, and skims from those spreads ran back through channels. Tony understood intimately. None of it looked dramatic. It looked like a city functioning, which is exactly how he wanted it to look. One of Tony's closest concerns through this period was internal discipline. Money on the street tempted underlings to hold back. The rule inside the outfit held. Everyone took their cut, and a fixed percentage traveled upward. Shorting the top was the fastest way to ruin. Newspapers later wrote about sudden disappearances or bodies found far from home. This story does not need those details. It is enough to say that enforcement existed, that people around the machine understood consequences, and that these consequences kept the machine running quietly. Tony's home life stayed deliberately plain. He lived in River Forest, a calm suburb of tree-lined streets and brick houses. Neighbors saw a man who nodded politely, kept the lawn tidy, and drove carefully. He went to church, donated to causes that put his name in programs, and treated store clerks with courtesy. Reporters took pictures of him coming and going, looking like an accountant. That surface was part shield, part suit of armor. If he looked ordinary enough, he could blend into any room that wasn't already looking for him. The late 1950s brought one more national show that Tony made sure to watch from a distance. Congressional hearings on union racketeering became must-see television. Hoffa sparred with senators. Lawyers jousted with witnesses. Viewers at home saw how deeply the underworld and certain locals had intertwined. The signal lesson for Tony was that the country had learned to look, and look hard. He shrank his visible footprint even further. He let Giancana and other captains absorb the noise, sitting as chairman rather than host, keeping control over assignments, disputes, and budgets. Around this time, a minor case out of Missouri tagged one of Tony's lieutenants with a wildlife violation: migratory birds transported across state lines. It sounded silly in print. It was not silly to the people around the table. If law enforcement could use any lever to build a record, they would. Small wins today could grow into bigger cases tomorrow. Tony repeated an old instruction: avoid travel with obligations attached. Avoid having your name appear in places it does not need to appear. Take the long view on risk. Chicago's tentacles reached into California beyond any one scheme. In Los Angeles, projectionists, set carpenters, and location crews had locals with histories worth understanding. Back in the 1940s, that world had already produced a high-profile extortion case that sent senior Chicago figures to prison. After that, Tony insisted on cleaner distance. Influence remained, but he wanted more buffers, more intermediaries, more legitimate fronts that made it hard for any prosecutor to draw straight lines. Friends of friends held stakes in freight companies that delivered to studio lots. A talent manager introduced owners to lenders, who happened to be backed by pension money. Everyone insisted it was business. Everyone got paid. The same template worked in Florida, where dog tracks, Jai-Alai, and beachside bars were fertile ground for skims and protection. Giancana's romantic life and a string of alleged political connections pushed heat to a simmer. Columnists loved the story of a mob boss dating a glamorous singer. The woman later claimed she had relationships with both a president and the Chicago boss, a claim that fed decades of books and arguments. Another Chicago-connected operator, a smooth talker with ties in Los Angeles and Washington, became a link in tales about plots aimed at a Caribbean revolutionary. Some of those stories came from declassified memos, others from men who enjoyed telling stories. Tony listened, frowned, and returned to what mattered to him: balance sheets and control. The federal push under the Attorney General made a dent. Giancana faced pressure on tax questions, got cited for contempt, and eventually spent time in jail for refusing to answer questions. He came out sour and loud. Tony had had enough of improvisation. By the mid-1960s, he engineered a shift. Giancana was told to take a long vacation. He left the country and lived under watch in Mexico for a stretch. Chicago did not fall apart without him. Other frontmen stepped up. Sam Battaglia took a turn. Then Felix Milwaukee Phil Aldericio, each with their strengths and weaknesses, each aware that the man in River Forest remained the constant. Tony did not announce these rotations. He arranged them, checked the flow of reports, and replaced people when the numbers or the noise displeased him. Even while changing the face at the podium, Tony focused on Las Vegas. Legal gambling offered a pipeline that, if properly managed, could dwarf neighborhood games. Hotels needed financing to build. Unions could invest. The outfit could guide contracts to friendly vendors, and casino counting rooms could be skimmed at a fixed rate before profits were declared to the state. Chicago's share of that arrangement grew through aligned families in Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. They coordinated influence on Teamsters loans and brokered introductions to casino executives who understood the deal. The goal from Tony's seat was a stable skim. Nothing so greedy that regulators caught on. Nothing so sloppy that rumors became affidavits. That required the opposite of celebrity. It required discipline and silence. Law enforcement's view of him during these years hardened. Agents assigned to the Chicago squad filled notebooks with the same observations. He rarely spoke on the phone. He avoided bugged restaurants. He never discussed anything important in a place that might have a microphone. He held no public job that would justify the hours he seemed to work. And he owned assets he did not appear to be able to afford through declared income. They tried following the money through relatives or through front businesses. He anticipated that and diversified ownership. They tried flipping associates. He kept the number of people who could tie acts directly to him very small, and the ones who could were loyal, well compensated, or afraid, or all three. Meanwhile, the neighborhood rackets kept producing cash. The numbers game, those small daily bets on 3 digits, remained a fixture on the south and west sides. The outfit's cut came from controlling writers, runners, and payoff schedules. Bookmaking expanded into new sports as television made pro football and basketball more popular. Jukebox and cigarette vending routes continued to be treated like territories that required tribute, with bar owners paying rent for the privilege of having machines that drew customers. Strip clubs and after-hours joints opened and closed in cycles, always under a watchful eye, and always with a share reserved higher up. Every stream on its own looked modest. Together they built a river. Tony's personal habits reflected that river's size. He bought fine suits but nothing flashy. He enjoyed good food at private dinners, not crowded rooms. He took vacations, never longed to places where he knew people, and where no one asked for photographs. He maintained an air of mild detachment even among his own crew, which added to his authority. Men who craved his approval rarely got emotion from him. They got clear directives and a sense of whether they were rising or falling. He believed that affection clouded judgment. Respect in his system came from competence and obedience. In the courts, he remained a ghost. When charged, he posted bond without drama, sat through proceedings in a calm suit, and left buildings with a polite nod to the cameras. When files were opened years later, they showed how often cases collapsed over technical issues, weak witnesses, or evidence gathered in ways judges rejected. Prosecutors fumed that a man whose organization reached into every vice had barely any convictions on his record. Defense lawyers shrugged. The law required proof. Rumor did not count. Tony counted on that distinction and built his life around it. By the mid-1960s, with Giancana abroad, Tony had reasserted a vision of the outfit that felt like his earlier tenure, less spectacle, more routine. Unions were to be milked quietly. Construction schedules were to be obeyed. Skims were to be modest and regular. Partners in other cities were to be consulted before any major move. Younger men were to be trained in small responsibilities before touching anything important. And everyone, from Cicero to the Strip, was to remember that heat kills profit. It would not stay calm forever. The next years would test that blueprint with new pressures. Nevada regulators getting smarter. Reformers inside City Hall gaining courage. Sensational books and movies that made the public hungry for stories. and an old exile returning home with grudges. Tony would meet those changes the way he had met every storm since he was a teenager, by watching diagonals others missed, by choosing proxies carefully, and by correcting course before outsiders understood that a turn had happened. For the moment, though, as the 1960s moved past their midpoint, the quiet man from River Forest had what he wanted. Distance from headlines, steady returns from a lattice of rackets, and the authority to swap faces at the front of the room whenever the faces started to enjoy the mirror too much. He drove home on a summer night, the kind Illinois gives now and then, with warm air and blinking porch lights and neighbors sitting on steps. He parked, went inside, placed his keys in the same ceramic dish as always, checked the lock on the back door, and sat in a chair near the window. The phone on the side table would not ring at that hour. That was by design. The machine he built ran on schedules and rules, not emergencies and boasts. He closed his eyes, saving his voice for a day he hoped would never come. The 1960s faded out with sirens, parades, and a new law that would haunt old crews. Congress passed a statute that let prosecutors charge leaders for patterns of racketeering, even if they never touched the day-to-day. Lawyers called it RICO. The man in River Forest read every line his counsel placed before him. He had lived by one principle since his days under older bosses: distance is protection. Now the law tried to erase distance. He responded the only way he knew, by tightening the chain of command and moving further into the background. Sam Battaglia, a tough captain with a heavy presence, took the front chair after the Giancana storm. Agents circled and courts remained busy. Battaglia was soon swallowed by a case that sent him away. Felix Milwaukee Phil Aldericio filled the gap for a stretch, sharp and efficient, until indictments and health cut him down. The turnover didn't rattle the quiet chairman. He treated the face at the podium like a replaceable part, not the engine. Behind those rotations he kept schedules running, cash routes steady and tempers in check. A man could be famous inside that world for a year or three. The man in the shadows arranged who came next. Paul Ricca, the elder statesman who had once called many signals, died in 1972. With Ricca gone, there was no doubt who sat at the true head of the table. Respect for the River Forest voice turned into near reverence. He didn't bully to gain it. He had accumulated it over decades of unbroken reliability. After Aldericio's fall, he elevated Joseph Ayupa, Cicero-rooted, cautious and loyal, to be the front boss. Ayupa understood how to read the room and how to read his chairman. He also understood that every day in that job was borrowed time. He ran the suburbs with the predictability of a factory clock, shepherding clubs, taverns, and card rooms that looked like regular neighborhood haunts but paid tribute all the same. Meanwhile, the future lay in the desert. Nevada's legal casinos were the cleanest-looking way to print money if you moved smart and stayed patient. Loans from a giant union pension fund helped build hotels with glittering signs. In return, the people who arranged those loans expected influence and a cut, though never in writing. To guard that stream, the outfit needed two kinds of men in Las Vegas: a face who could run operations without a license, and a protector who would remind reluctant partners that promises were not optional. A gifted gambling mind, who couldn't get a gaming card, found work in a back-office setting, betting lines, staffing pits, and guiding managers. An enforcer from Chicago, a street-taught prodigy with a reputation for pressure and hustle, moved west to keep order. Neither man had an official title that matched his authority. That was the point. They were fixtures in restaurants, sports books, and jewelry stores that served as meeting rooms after dark. If anyone asked, they were businessmen who liked the sun. The chairman's approach to Nevada was plain: keep the skim reasonable, keep the decision tree tight, and keep egos out of the count room. Midwestern allies in Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Cleveland held their own interests at a few properties and joined the arrangement. Everyone understood the terms. A small slice came off before the state ever saw the books. Each city took its portion according to formulas worked out in quiet conversations. No one was to get greedy. No one was to talk. For much of the 1970s, the system worked as designed. Back home, the everyday economy kept the outfit's base warm. The numbers game still fluttered through working-class blocks. Bookmakers expanded with television's rise, taking action on Sunday football, college hoops, and boxing. Coin machines multiplied, jukeboxes, pinball, later video games, each placed with a bar owner who preferred not to ask too many questions about where the route came from. Waste hauling, a dull business to outsiders, became a gold mine. A company that controlled pickups in an area could lift rates with little pushback, especially if rivals had trucks with mysteriously flat tires or union crews who didn't show. Produce markets and meat-packing houses sat under quiet oversight that determined which vendors got stalls and whose deliveries went to the back of the line. Airports and municipal projects offered contracts to friends, and friends passed envelopes. It didn't look like action. It looked like logistics. That was perfect. Federal agents in Chicago responded with new tactics. They put microphones where deals were supposed to feel safe. Banquet rooms, private lounges, back offices of social clubs. They tracked pension board votes, flight schedules, bank deposits, marriage ties. A few bugs produced hours of tape that sounded like old men discussing weather, horses, and grandchildren. But every so often, a sentence slipped that acknowledged money moving, a name to be called, a delivery to be avoided, a threat disguised as advice. Agents compiled charts and asked prosecutors to think in maps, not single scenes. The chairman anticipated this and simplified his life even more. He went on more walks, took fewer phone calls, and let other men handle words. In 1974, the exile returned. Sam Giancana, older, angrier, and convinced that people had eaten his meals during his time away, came back to the Chicago area. A grand jury wanted him. Reporters wanted him more. He faced questions about politics, casinos, and international whispers that had followed him. He offered little, then less. Friends of the chairman found themselves between a man who wanted back in and a man who hated noise. In the summer of 1975, Giancana was found dead in his home. Multiple shots, a mystery that kept writers busy for decades. Law enforcement suggested motives and suspects. Books pointed fingers in every direction. The chairman, predictably, said nothing. If he expressed an opinion, it was in small private gestures, a pointed reminder to captains that headlines kill margin, a quiet shuffle of assignments, a stiffer test for anyone who thought they could freelance. The machine did not even pause. That year played host to other reckonings. A flamboyant loan shark whose court testimony in earlier years had humiliated some associates was discovered slain in a garage. A former police officer who doubled as a courier and fixer met a violent end in a snack shop on the northwest side. Each death became a puzzle for detectives, and a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to monetize secrets. The chairman didn't want chaos. He wanted silence. Sometimes, silence arrived in terrible ways. This story will not linger on the details. It is enough to say that after those episodes, fewer men raised their voices. Joseph Ayupa kept the Cicero office humming. He had once been arrested with cages of mourning doves, earning a backhanded nickname that followed him into legend. The joke masked a careful mind. He was conservative with money, loyal to the chairman, and content to let others think he ran the show while he followed instructions from a modest house where the front walk was always swept. Ayupa approved more trips to Las Vegas. He greenlit stronger fences around profitable clubs. He ensured that captains understood the new legal landscape. One wrong sentence captured on a tape could now pull everyone into a case. He ordered fewer large gatherings and more one-on-one walks in parks or around blocks with passing traffic to cover any stray words. In the desert, the plan began to creak under greed and hubris. The gambling expert who ran floors without a license became a minor celebrity, a man whose picks and opinions made headlines. Regulators placed him in their black book, formally excluding him from casinos. He worked anyway, through proxies, through relatives, by sitting in lounges with a view of the pit and sending instructions with nods. He frustrated the state and irritated partners. The enforcer from Chicago grew a crew that liked burglaries and big scores around Las Vegas jewelry stores and private homes. Their spree earned a tabloid name and the kind of attention the chairman despised. The Las Vegas scheme still produced money, but the human pieces started to wobble. Out west, flamboyance was a currency. Back in River Forest, flamboyance was a fee no one had budgeted. While those frictions built, the chairman's personal life stayed as ordinary as he could make it. He woke early, read the paper at his kitchen table, visited his tailor, ate at restaurants that didn't list a phone number. He went fishing now and then, a habit the press never let him forget. He spoke softly, if at all, in public. He paid for groceries in cash. He attended weddings and funerals with the face of a man who had seen every version of both. Reporters tried to read his eyes. The eyes gave nothing away. Agents tried to pry open his finances. The tax cases that had hounded him earlier returned in new clothes. Prosecutors alleged that his lifestyle exceeded declared income, that certain assets could only be explained by hidden streams. Defense lawyers chewed on technicalities and pointed to legitimate investments, car dealerships, a bakery, a laundry, a construction company. Appeals dragged on. A conviction seemed to land. then dissolved under appellate review. The record shows how carefully he worked to keep proof scarce. Ambition could be ferocious inside the outfit. Ambition inside a prosecutor's office could be ferocious too. The difference was that the chairman never let his ego write checks. His plans couldn't cash. In the late 1970s, an event at home pierced that calm. Burglars broke into the River Forest house while the family was away. They didn't just take, they desecrated the place, dumping drawers, flipping furniture, ripping up floors in search of safes. For a man who built his life around control, the violation cut deep. Word spread that jewelry and cash vanished, items that carried more than monetary value. The street took notice. Within months, several men connected in rumor to the break-in turned up dead in different locations. Detectives recorded patterns. Columnists wrote that an invisible line had been crossed, and that the city's most patient man had responded in a way only his world recognized. No charges tied those murders to anyone. No indictment reached the chairman. But the lesson traveled fast. Some houses should never be touched. The burglary, and what followed, crystallized who he was. He could absorb press attention. He could absorb court dates. He could even absorb a flashy subordinate drawing scowls from regulators. What he would not absorb was a direct insult to the sanctuary he had built for his family. After that episode, his patience for sloppiness evaporated. In Las Vegas, he pushed for a cleanup. Less show, more discipline, fewer side crimes that invited needless heat. In Chicago, he cut off petty crews who had been tolerated for years. He rewarded the most dependable men with larger territories and reminded everyone that the ultimate goal had always been the same: steady income with the smallest possible footprint. Meanwhile, the federal picture shifted yet again. Multi-city investigations traced the Teamsters' pension loans into the desert and back. Undercover recordings in Kansas City picked up trusted voices talking about counts in casino cages and distributions back to Midwestern families. Those tapes, married to ledgers and stool pigeon details, formed the spine of a case that would explode in the 1980s. For now, it lived as murmurs in hallways and sealed filings. The chairman read the weather, not the forecast. He began to prepare for storms by moving money into deeper hideaways, by pushing more businesses into the names of relatives, by widening the use of legitimate fronts with tax returns that could withstand cursory audit. He had survived every era by anticipating the rulebook. He was not going to stop in his 70s. Chicago in those years felt like a city balancing on two truths. One truth lived in sunshine. Sports-filled stadiums, skyscrapers rose, lakefront parks drew families. The other lived in the shade of awnings. Envelopes traveled, machines whirred without permits. Union stewards negotiated with men who did not sit on official committees. The chairman moved through both worlds like a ghost. He attended charity dinners with a calm smile, and later that night reviewed notes on bookmaking totals. He sent flowers to a baptism, and then discussed a supplier who needed to be reminded about a late payment. He never raised his voice in either setting. The deaths that rocked his circle across the mid-1970s built an aura that would follow him to the end of his life. People believed, whether fair or not, that nothing profound happened in the outfit without his permission. That belief did work for him. It discouraged freelancing. It made new captains think twice before inventing side deals. It also invited extra attention from law enforcement. An agent who once stood across a courtroom lobby from him wrote later that the air changed when the River Forest man entered. Quiet, deliberate, wary. The agent spent his career trying to put the chairman behind bars. He retired without a trophy. The chairman lived with that as validation of his method. Do less, hide more, and never be the only bridge between a crime and a courtroom. As the 1970s wound down, the outfit's map looked broader and more complicated than in the Capone days, but less gaudy. Suburban municipalities held more action than downtown. The Strip glittered, but the true money lived in bland offices where skim totals were whispered, and in Midwest diners where couriers passed padded envelopes beneath newspapers. UFO kept Cicero as the heart that pumped cash. Other trusted figures managed bookmaking, slots, clubs, and crews. The chairman sat above all of it, a man in his late 70s, whose health seemed robust, whose memory stayed crisp, whose rules remained iron. He had outlasted reformers, sensational hearings, local crusaders, and younger bosses who mistook fame for power. He had adapted to a legal weapon designed to hold men like him accountable. He had extended his reach to a desert where the sun never seemed to set. He had protected his home, defiantly some would say, and then returned to routines without a public word. He had seen friends die natural deaths, and others die in ways that left long shadows. Through it all, he kept returning to the same habit: wake early, say little, move pieces, check the ledgers, and correct course before anyone else realized the current had changed. The next era would bring the most concentrated legal attack he had ever faced. A federal case built in another city would reach into Las Vegas counting rooms, through Kansas City kitchens, into Milwaukee back offices, across Cleveland clubs, and into Cicero. Cameras would follow agents carrying boxes from casinos. Old men would be led into courtrooms in handcuffs. One of the chairman's most trusted front bosses would trade his comfortable house for a cell far from Illinois. In the desert, the flamboyant enforcer would lose his footing, then vanish. The gambling wizard would watch a car explode and leave town. The chairman would not escape untouched, but as always, he would find ways to bend, ways to live to the next day, ways to remind a changing world that silence, not spectacle, had kept him free longer than any of his peers. The new decade opened with the sound of paper more than sirens, indictments drafted in quiet rooms, transcripts rolled out by agents who had waited years for judges to sign off on microphones, and bank records that, when spread on a long table, mapped a road from Midwest kitchens to casino cages in the desert. The law that had been written to reach leaders who never touched the money began to mature. Prosecutors stopped looking for a single dramatic act and started telling juries about patterns: loans from a giant union fund to hotel projects, secret authority given to men who could never qualify for a casino card, weekly counts smoothed before they hit the ledger, and envelopes that traveled east on a schedule. The man in River Forest, decades into his reign as the quiet chairman, understood what the shift meant. Distance would not save anyone if agents could persuade a jury that strings ran from his city to the Strip. He responded the way he always did, by pulling back, trimming words, and tightening the circle of people who could plausibly connect him to anything. Nevada had seemed for years like the perfect pivot from the old street economy to something larger and steadier. Hotels went up with loans from the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. A young owner fronted a company that took control of established properties on the Strip. The state saw a businessman at the microphone, clean on paper and backed by lenders who carried proud union credentials. In back rooms, a different structure existed. A gifted handicapper blacklisted by regulators set policy on the casino floors. A Chicago enforcer ran street matters, debts, protection, discipline, and in his time, a side crew of burglars who earned headlines in the worst way. Other cities had seats at the table: Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland. Each expected a slice, quietly taken from the count room before the state got its share. For a while, it worked because it was boring. And boring, to the chairman, had always been the point. Then the seam started to show. The handicapper became a celebrity, even after the state put him in its book of banned figures. He still found ways to sit with a view of the pit and to send instructions without using his name. That defiance irritated regulators and drew cameras. The enforcer built a burglary crew that hit the wrong targets and ran loudly. On a summer night, a bomb tore the bottom out of the handicapper's car as he got behind the wheel. He survived. He left Nevada soon after, alive but done in that town. Each of those episodes added heat. The chairman believed Las Vegas was supposed to be a machine, not a tabloid. He took note. Back in the Midwest, a small microphone hidden in a Kansas City restaurant picked up conversations about casino counts. Another set of ears in a Missouri kitchen captured talk about deliveries, shares, and complaints that someone had gotten too greedy. Those tapes, combined with travel records, coded notes, and the testimony of insiders who had decided prison was colder than a witness chair, became the foundation of a layered case that reached across 5 cities. Prosecutors gave it a simple story. Loans went out, control came in, and money came back without being reported. Names on those indictments included leaders in Kansas City and Milwaukee, figures from Cleveland, trusted couriers, and in time, the man who ran Cicero for Chicago and his second. The chairman's true gift had always been avoiding papers that said his name. He kept that tradition. His frontmen stood in court. He did not. The Teamsters, once a reliable spigot, became less predictable. Federal pressure on the union, which had started with televised jousting in the late 1950s, deepened. The man who had run the union and craved a return to power vanished in 1975, a disappearance that remains a point of speculation to this day. Detroit names filled the core of that story. People whispered that other cities had opinions about whether he should come back, but proof never met a courtroom. What did meet courtrooms in the 1980s was federal oversight over the pension fund, steeper scrutiny of loans, and consent decrees that started to close the old bank. The outfit had to adjust to a world in which a single committee could no longer grease the wheels of a hotel project in the desert. Chicago's household economy did not stop because of troubles in Nevada. Bookmaking grew with cable television. Sundays turned into workdays for writers and runners who kept phones busy until kickoff. The numbers game still lived in neighborhoods that rarely made the news except when a school won a title or a street fair closed traffic for an afternoon. Bar owners knew which route men would place machines that drank coins all night and which route men would cause a problem if rebuffed. Waste companies held territory like medieval lords. Produce markets, meatpacking, and warehouse districts still ran better if someone solved disputes quickly and under the table. The chairman's design, 100 dull streams that fed a river, held. Yet the 1980s brought a harder edge from law enforcement in Chicago as well. One colossal investigation, run by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI, targeted crooked judges, prosecutors, and middlemen in Cook County. Cases had nicknames. Agents flipped lawyers who had been part of the inside game and turned them into wired witnesses. A powerful ward that for decades had served as a bridge between City Hall and street crews faced a withering years-long probe. Meetings that once felt untouchable got taped. Courthouses that once felt like home turf turned hostile. The chairman saw the change and reminded his people, fewer phone calls, more walks. Fewer scheduled gatherings, more chance meetings, fewer favors for strangers who asked too many questions. The loudest consequence of the Las Vegas heat arrived not with handcuffs but with a pair of deaths that still echo. The enforcer who had brought his Chicago style to the Strip had made enemies in law enforcement and among certain partners, especially after his burglary crew collapsed in a botched raid at a gift shop. By 1986, with indictments stacking up in the skim cases, and with Chicago's front boss staring down a trial in a Midwestern courtroom, the leadership faced a choice. The enforcer and his brother were found dead, buried off a field in Indiana. Later trials and informants suggested that senior leaders across the outfit had blessed the decision to remove him. Names floated, hierarchies were guessed at and mapped. This story will not indulge in the exact details. It is enough to say that message discipline returned to Las Vegas after those graves. The trials that followed the desert tapes were brutal for the men who served as the chairman's shield. Joseph Abwapa, the Cicero-based front boss who had steered collections and suburban operations for years, went to trial with his deputy. The government story built on the Kansas City tapes, on ledgers, and on witnesses who had sat at casino tables when the drop was counted, persuaded juries. Abwapa and his second were convicted and handed long sentences. Leaders in Kansas City and Milwaukee faced the same fate. A Cleveland elder who had once been part of the quiet oversight of the skim did something his generation almost never did. He cooperated. His testimony, combined with the tapes, salted the ground under the old arrangement. The skim as a regular operation died. Nevada, hungry to prove it could police itself, brought in seasoned gaming managers from a family company to stabilize the properties that had been abused. Audits deepened, security improved. The language of suitability and integrity became more than words in a brochure. The era of big, easy slices went away. New money came from corporations with accountants, boards, and SEC filings. The outfit had to revisit the old truth. When the window closes in one place, you look for another, smaller window somewhere else. With Aopa gone to prison, the chairman selected a new face at the front. He chose Joseph Ferriola, a South Side product known for patience with profits and impatience with disrespect. Ferriola had come up through loan sharking, gambling, and union pressure, and he had contacts in crews that could handle either money or muscle. He knew how the chairman liked things: quiet accounts, the right envelopes, honest books in public companies that masked flows behind them. Health would cut Ferriola's tenure short, but for a handful of years he gave the outfit a tone the chairman favored: low profile, consistent numbers, no experiments. River Forest had been the chairman's longtime base, but as years stacked and his needs changed, he spent more time farther out, in Barrington Hills, where the lots were bigger, the houses sat behind long drives, and neighbors respected privacy. He was an older man now, though his gait stayed even, and his memory remained sharp. He still favored suits with narrow stripes, polished shoes, and a demeanor that could be mistaken for a banker's. Reporters kept their distance more as years passed, unsure whether the old man would even look at them. When he did, the expression was the same as it had been in the 1950s, calm, mildly amused, watching angles. Agents did not give up because of age. They refreshed task forces, taught younger colleagues the history, and tried new tools. They studied pagers and payphones and stuck tiny transmitters under conference tables. They watched waiters deliver drinks at the right moment to cover a sentence. They followed wives to luncheons and sons to ball games, tried to find pressure points in tax returns, and floated offers to men who had lost favor. The chairman's counter remained the same: compartmentalize, limit who speaks with whom, assign couriers who are polite, punctual, and unconnected to anything else, never say in one sentence what can be said with 3 nods and a shrug. The city around him changed. The mills along the Calumet slowed. Some closed. New businesses moved into old buildings, storage, import-export firms, small manufacturers, service companies that thrived on logistics rather than smoke. The outfit found ways to adapt, applying old methods to new sectors. Trucking still carried goods. Warehousing still created choke points. Permits still controlled who could open where. Inspectors still had discretion. City council committees still moved contracts. The names and technologies shifted. The core remained. Someone who could simplify problems for a fee would always find work. Politically, an older network that had linked one ward to the outfit's informal diplomacy was weakening. A lawyer who had grown rich running favors on that ward's floor broke with his mentors, went to the government, and wore a wire for years. Cases fell like dominoes: aldermen, fixers, bagmen, and connected contractors. Trials in the early 1990s put a dent in a tradition of backroom meetings at a downtown restaurant that had for decades served as the unofficial annex of city politics. The chairman watched the fall with a steady face. He had never relied on one place. He had built redundancy into every part of his life. Tax questions returned, as they always had. The IRS, convinced that no one could live as well as he did on the income he declared, kept trying to make a case. Lawyers answered subpoenas. Accountants pointed to legitimate firms: a trucking company here, a car dealership there, a construction outfit with bids that matched market prices, a bakery that had paid sales tax for decades. An indictment here or there surfaced against a subordinate or a relative. Trials ended with mixed results. Through it all, the man at the center stayed out of prison. Agents grumbled that juries wanted photographs, tapes, something visceral. The chairman made sure they never got it. Meanwhile, the outfit managed a brittle peace inside its own ranks. The 1978 burglary of the chairman's home had left a scar. The response that followed had taught a painful lesson. In the 1980s, anyone tempted to freelance near the chairman's orbit hesitated. That restraint kept certain feuds from boiling. It did not eliminate friction. Younger men saw opportunities in drugs that older men had always avoided because of the kind of attention narcotics brought. The chairman had long discouraged narcotics traffic, a rule rooted in both ethics he claimed to hold and in hard pragmatism. Some captains obeyed. Others looked away as crews took risks. When those risks led to heat, the consequences landed not only on dealers, but on anyone who appeared on the same charts. More than once, the chairman had to mediate quietly, shifting people, shrinking zones, and reminding lieutenants that greed is a tax you pay twice, first in money, then in attention. By the late 1980s, a generational shift was underway. Men who had stood next to the chairman in the 1950s and 60s were gone, or sick, or in prison. He had outlived most of his peers across the country, including some who had been famous enough to be played on movie screens. He named replacements who understood his priorities. Sam Carlisi took on a larger role when Ferriola's health failed. Rocco Infalascia held territory. Leaders of the old Chinatown crew managed extortion and gambling with care. These men did not claim a city like Capone once had. They managed portfolios, suburbs, unions, sports books, vending, construction, waste. The design looked more like a holding company than a street gang. That was by design. He also took care to put more of his wealth into safe forms. Trusts, partnerships, and family holdings multiplied and moved. Lawyers drafted documents that would seem ordinary to any estate planner. Mortgages were paid off. Titles were transferred quietly. He had studied who lost everything when prison knocked. He had no intention of leaving his family exposed if the worst ever landed on his door. Las Vegas, once the outfit's dream of sterile profit, had moved on. Corporations owned the big rooms. Publicly traded companies answered to analysts. New properties opened on themes, family fun and Broadway shows. If someone whispered about a skim, they were shushed by a compliance officer with 2 degrees and a mandate. The outfit still had friends at cafeterias and card rooms away from the strip. It still played in sports books through locals who could blend in at any counter. But the era of casino cages quietly paying Midwest envelopes had ended. The chairman accepted it like a businessman who watches a product cycle crest and fade. You pivot, you find margin somewhere else, you never beg the past to return. What remained always was Chicago. He could drive a few miles in any direction and pass a dozen businesses tied in some small way to his world. A contractor who had needed help getting a permit, a bar that had rented a machine route instead of buying one, a shop owner who had taken a loan with no questions asked and too much interest charged. He could attend a funeral and know the backstory behind half the suits near the casket. He could sit in a restaurant and see which tables belonged to whom, all without a word said. This was his city. He did not own it, but he had shaped parts of it so quietly and for so long that it whispered his name even when no one wanted to speak it. He stayed careful about what he read and whom he trusted. He listened to the radio for scores and weather. He watched the evening news like any retiree, his expression unmoved. He still walked a little every day, usually at odd hours, usually on routes that gave him clear sight lines. He kept old habits that had kept him out of courtrooms and cemeteries. He was not lucky. He was cautious, and caution, learned young and applied without fail, had carried him past men who had once looked larger than life but who had not built lives that could withstand pressure. The 1980s took from him institutions that had been central to the outfit's rise: easy Teamsters money, a lax view of casino oversight, a political ward that brokered favors with the ease of an umpire calling balls and strikes. They also took friends, some in prison drab, some lowered into graves, some simply tired and gone. What those years could not take was the one asset he prized most, his ability to make people follow rules without him ever having to raise his voice. As the decade closed, older than any boss who had come close to his influence, he still spent mornings with coffee and a quiet stack of notes, still met a man in a booth with a view of the door, still corrected course by inches rather than miles. New challenges waited in the next calendar, new informants, new laws, new crusaders, and a city growing more complicated by the month. He would meet them with the same tools he had always used: patience, stillness, and a mind that could see 3 moves beyond the next conversation. Age arrived the way he liked everything to arrive, quietly. A new decade rolled in without a parade for him, without a retirement party, without a quote in the paper. He had lived long enough to see his careful style become the outfit's default setting: fewer shouts, more schedules, fewer legends, more ledgers. The country around him had changed. Prosecutors now built cases like mosaics, pulling tiles from union loans, casino audit trails, phone records, parking slips, and whispers caught on hidden microphones. Agents talked about patterns and continuity, not one big job. He understood the shift and met it with the same tools he had used since the 1930s: distance, patience, and a stubborn refusal to leave fingerprints on anything that moved money. The street still murmured about the break-in at his River Forest home years earlier, and the message that followed. The lesson stuck. No one touched his family again. He had moved farther out, to a spread that placed trees and gravel between the road and his door. Barrington Hills offered him space and the kind of privacy he had spent a lifetime buying in other ways. From that address, older now but still composed, he handled what he had always handled: decisions about who ran day to day, reminders about rules, and the occasional correction when someone forgot that he preferred profit to fanfare. Leadership at the front rotated again. After the prison terms that closed the Las Vegas skim era, Joseph Ferriola took point. He fit the moment: serious, profit-minded, allergic to spectacle. Health cut him down in 1989. The chairman did what he always did. He named a new face and kept the engine running. Sam Carlisi, nicknamed for a light step and steady habits, took over much of the public burden, with Rocco Infelici and others managing pieces of the map. Each man knew the arrangement. The chairman would not hover over their shoulders in crowded rooms. He would sit a step back and expect order. Order depended on adapting to a city whose rules were changing. The old river of casino skim money had dried up when corporations, regulators, and federal tapes converged. That did not end the outfit. It forced a pivot. Gray market video poker machines appeared in back corners of taverns and social clubs. They were not licensed in Illinois at the time, but they drew steady coins. Route men placed them, split takes with owners, and spread tribute upward. Bookmaking moved to pagers and payphones, with runners cycling through apartments used for a month, then abandoned. Wire rooms shrank to a handful of clean phones and one television. Collections by hand stayed constant. Sunday nights, Monday mornings, always with a notebook that vanished if a door knocked the wrong way. Labor remained the quiet core. Men who controlled who showed up at a loading dock or who could pour concrete on a site still controlled timelines and costs. That leverage did not end when one union boss fell or one contractor went to court. It survived because cities always build and transport. At O'Hare, a place that had once been a fountain for contracts and subcontracts, the names on clipboards changed, but the logic behind a past envelope did not. Waste hauling routes, as prosaic as anything, stayed valuable. Trucks had keys, drivers kept schedules. Crews could be friendly or late. A modest fee made them friendly. Politics, long treated as another market, became more dangerous. In the 1980s, Operation Greylord had exposed cash-for-favor networks in the courts. Juries heard recordings of case-fixing schemes that stained robes and sent a line of courtroom insiders to prison. In the early 1990s, another probe focused on a powerful ward where, for decades, favors flowed like water. A defense lawyer who knew the ward's floor by heart flipped, wore a wire, and brought down figures who had been treated like gatekeepers. An alderman from that ward stood trial and lost. A veteran fixer died before facing a jury. The fall of that machine mattered to the chairman. He had never let the outfit rely on one ward, one judge, one restaurant. He built redundancy on purpose. Even so, the shockwaves reminded him that City Hall was no longer a comfortable living room for old friends. His own political whisperer faced a reckoning too. For years, a soft-spoken liaison had acted as the outfit's bridge to a certain kind of city business. Licenses, unions, small introductions. He never needed to raise his tone. In 1992, federal prosecutors brought a racketeering case against him centered on extortion and union leverage. He was convicted and given a long sentence. For the outfit, the verdict cut a line that had been in place for decades. For the chairman, it was a confirmation that the era of backroom deals with no consequences had ended. He adjusted again. More layers, fewer direct asks, a premium on patience. Those years also saw prosecutions that closed chapters on crews who had been too bold for too long. Rocco Infelice went to trial and lost. Carlisi faced a major racketeering indictment, and not long after the chairman's death went away too. The cases were built the way modern cases were always built. Informants, tapes, ledgers, coded calls, wiretaps, whose transcripts read like puzzles about deliveries and schedules. Jurors did not need blood to vote guilty, they needed patterns. The chairman read those transcripts when lawyers brought copies by. He did not comment much. He had been predicting this evolution since the first time he watched a microphone come out of a wall in a congressional hearing room. On the street there was always an appetite for a different kind of money, the kind that ran on powdered risks and quick gains. He never liked it. He banned it in plain terms and with a hard edge. Narcotics invited federal heat, unreliable partners, and the kind of violence that made headlines. He had spent a lifetime dragging the outfit away from scenes that bled into newspapers. Some crews ignored him. They paid for it. Others obeyed and stuck to sports, cards, unions, machines, and loans. That divide marked much of the late 1980s and early 1990s. In quiet meetings, he told captains what he had told them for years. There is cash in discipline, and there is prison in improvisation. He kept his routines. Even as years added up, he woke early, read the papers twice, kept appointments at the same barber, selected the same shoes, ate at the same quiet places where he could sit with his back to a wall and a view of the door. He did not linger over meals. He did not clog tables with laughter. He conversed in low tones and nodded more than he spoke. Those habits were not effect. They were armor. A man who never changed his roots was easier to watch, but a man who never changed his behavior was harder to catch. Detectives who watched him saw nothing theatrical. Agents who sat in cars took pictures of an elderly gentleman who carried himself like any retiree from a firm that had never issued business cards. He watched his grandchildren grow, attended family events without letting them turn into public theater, and kept his private life as sealed as a safe. He liked to fish when he could. The old photograph that had given him his Big Tuna nickname still made the rounds now and then, and he still disliked it. He was never a nickname kind of man. Never a man who believed that charm could replace structure. What he trusted were lists, and the ability to say no. Lawyers kept him insulated from the worst storms. Tax agents took another run at him, pulling at threads that had frayed years earlier, alleging lifestyle beyond reported income. Counsel responded with the same set of truths that had worked before. Legitimate companies on paper, investments that could be audited, returns filed on time. Prosecutors wanted testimony that would draw a straight line from a phone call to a bag of money to a command. They did not get it. He had spent his adult life removing those lines, making sure that if a case came, it would come against someone else. The result again was that the man many believed had set rules for half a century never had a long prison number attached to his name. The city around him embraced new distractions. Sports talk filled radio. New skyscrapers rose beside old stone. The lakefront gleamed. Riverboats launched on state-approved waters. A legal version of gambling wrapped in a regulatory blanket. Illinois was still learning to hold tight. He watched with the curiosity of a man who had spent a lifetime studying how rules were written and how they were bent. He understood that legal gambling would create opportunities and barriers at the same time. Some of his successors would try to move into that gray space. He would not be there to see the consequences. In May 1992, his long run ended in the simplest way. No raid, no courtroom pronouncement, no sidewalk scene. He died at home, an old man in Barrington Hills, the quiet intact to the last. News outlets ran obituaries that read like summations of a novel. Capone apprenticed to suburban patriarch, a span that almost no one else in his world managed. Reporters used the same photographs they had always used: the fishing shot, the hat and coat courthouse doorway, the half smile at a parking garage. They quoted agents who had spent careers chasing him and never getting the one tape they wanted. They quoted lawyers who said, "Again, that rumor is not evidence." They quoted neighbors who had known him as a polite gentleman who kept to himself. His funeral, like his life, was careful. A church he had attended saw the pews fill with family and a handful of faces that made reporters perk up. There were flowers, brief eulogies, and a drive to a suburban cemetery where, without public drama, he was laid to rest. No speeches about legacy, no lists of achievements, just a closed circle and a city that returned to work. What he left behind was not a building or a foundation with his name on it. He left a design. The outfit he shaped by habit and will had become a network that treated vice like a portfolio and the city like a ledger. His rules: avoid heat, use fronts, keep cash flowing through dull businesses, reduce meetings, let someone else stand near cameras, set limits on greed, prefer routine to surprise, outlived him. The men who came after, whether they kept those rules or broke them, did so in his shadow. When they succeeded, it was usually because they honored the balance he had enforced. When they failed, it was usually because they forgot that attention is the most expensive luxury in their line of work. His crimes, spread over decades and continents, were not excuses for legend. They were harms that bent neighborhoods and corrupted institutions. Bookmaking hooked people who could not afford to lose. Loan sharking trapped shopkeepers and bar owners in cycles that lasted years. Illegal casinos siphoned cash and emboldened crooked cops and inspectors who looked away. Extortion put invisible taxes on businesses from taverns to construction sites. Labor racketeering warped fair bargaining into private leverage. The wire service takeover decades earlier had ensured that independent bookmakers would either bow or be crushed. The skim in Las Vegas diverted millions from publicly regulated enterprises into envelopes that funded a private empire. The intimidation of potential witnesses drained courage from communities that needed it. Violence, when it came, served to enforce silence. He stood atop that structure and insisted it run like a business because he knew that chaos breeds attention and attention breeds prison. He could also be, to people who never crossed his business line, a courteous neighbor, a generous donor at a parish fundraiser, a man who held doors and said thank you. That contradiction fooled some into thinking he was less than he was. It fooled no one who was paying attention. The calm exterior was a mask worn so long it fused with his skin. Under it sat a strategist who had adapted to every shift. Prohibition's end, Capone's fall, Nitty's suicide, Ricca's imprisonment, the Kefauver hearings, the birth of Rico, the Teamsters' rise in federal oversight, Nevada's corporate turn, the fall of a powerful ward, the arrival of younger bosses with TV habits. Through each, he made replacements, tightened screws, and followed the only goal he ever admitted to in his actions: stay free. After his death, the outfit did not collapse. It continued as a smaller, more cautious version of its former self, guided by lieutenants who had learned to speak softly and to think like accountants. Some leaders would be swept up in fresh cases built on long memories and new recordings. A major trial in the 2000s would dig into crimes committed when he was in charge, pulling up old secrets with DNA tools and declassified files no one had imagined in his prime. Jurors would hear about murders from the 1970s and 80s, and the men who carried them out. The names of bosses who had sat beneath him would be read out loud in a courtroom he never had to enter as a defendant. His ghost hovered over those proceedings because the crimes had been born under his rules, even if he had not spoken the final words that set each act in motion. The city he shaped in shadow learned to live with the idea that some of its truths were not on the surface. People who grew up near machines and bookies and small clubs still tell stories about the days when envelopes moved on Mondays and aldermen ate at restaurants where decisions slid across tables with the coffee. Younger Chicagoans hear those stories and shake their heads, unsure whether to believe them. That too would have pleased the chairman. Doubt was always one of his best defenses. At the end of his long run, the measure of his influence was simple. Count how many times he had been charged with something serious. Then count how many times he had walked out of a courthouse, breathed the cold air, and gone home to a house with trimmed hedges and a kitchen table where his glasses sat beside a folded newspaper. Count the bosses from other cities who ended with nicknames and headlines and long numbers stitched on prison uniforms. Then see where he ended. He did not end with glory. He ended with quiet. In his world, that was victory. He had been a boy in a crowded apartment who learned to keep his head down and his ears open. He had become the keeper of a machine that bribed, coerced, skimmed, and extracted. He had done it without turning himself into a symbol. He had raised a family in a suburb that waved to him on mornings when he watered his lawn. He had outlasted nearly everyone who had once ordered him around. He had taught men to think of crime as administration, and of administration as camouflage. That is his story, and it is not a romance. It is the tale of how discipline can extend harm further than noise ever could. On certain evenings, years later, old detectives will sit with coffee near the end of their shifts and trade memories. They will talk about the way he walked, the way he held a door, the way he avoided every trap they set for decades. They will not admire him. They will respect the skill that made their work harder. They will say, in tones heavy with experience, that he was the hardest quarry because he never ran. He just kept moving forward at the same pace, as if he knew the city would move around him. And it did, until the day it did not. Until the day he stopped in a quiet room with blinds drawn, as the sun sank beyond tall trees, and left the rest of the story to men who had learned from him how to speak softly, and hoped no one ever noticed their footsteps. He was gone, but the habits he taught stayed in the room like rules written on the walls. The men who had learned under him did not hold ceremonies. They kept schedules. They passed envelopes on Mondays. They moved machines when inspectors changed routes. They avoided cameras, avoided boasts, avoided the kind of scenes that had ruined other cities. Even the silence sounded like him. When people spoke about the outfit in the years after his death, they used new names and new case numbers, but the shape he had carved, the way authority bent around the suburbs, the way cash flowed through dull companies, the way lawyers stood between questions and answers held. In the early 1990s, a trial in Chicago broke the old belief that certain ward doors were forever closed to investigators. A veteran alderman was convicted after recordings captured how favors were priced, who had to be called, which judges could be nudged. The fixer who had made introductions for decades never reached a jury. He died before verdict. A soft-voiced liaison who had been a bridge between City Hall and the outfit was tried in federal court and found guilty of racketeering tied to extortion and union leverage. Those blows did not erase the methods Accardo had built, but they forced adjustments. The outfit lost convenient pathways and fell back on redundancy. Messages traveled different routes. Seating charts at restaurants changed. People who had always liked the same corner tables tried new places. Leadership at the front continued to rotate the way Accardo had intended when he set that pattern. After Joseph Iapa's long sentence, Iola's death from illness, Sam Carlisi took on more responsibility, with Rocco Infelici and others managing territories. Cases came. Convictions followed. The prosecutor's playbook, now mature, assembled money trails, coded calls, and small remarks caught on bugs. Jurors learned to read patterns instead of looking for one dramatic scene. The outfit adapted by making its daily work smaller, quieter, less centralized, but the basic economy still ran on the old engines. Bookmaking, machines, loans, labor, riverboats, and casinos on the legal side of the line changed the landscape. States that had once treated gambling like a taboo now licensed it in measured ways. Compliance officers replaced some of the old discretion. Auditors replaced certain envelope carriers. It was not a world Accardo would have enjoyed visiting. He had thrived in the shadows between legal and illegal. The new era drew brighter lines. Even so, there were gaps. Sports betting still lived on phones and pagers, then slowly on early computer screens. Gray market video machines glowed in back rooms. Local crews learned to manage those devices with the same care they once gave jukeboxes. Route men kept notebooks. Bartenders looked the other way as long as split sheets stayed fair. Union influence shifted but never disappeared. A foreman who decided who could pour concrete still had power. So did a steward who controlled who could unload trucks at a trade show. The outfit knew those choke points well. For years, Accardo had taught his people to see leverage where other eyes saw routine. That mindset did not fade. The names of the locals changed. Board members came and went. Oversight tightened. Yet the old logic persisted. If a job could be delayed, a fee could be requested to keep it on time. The difference after Accardo's death was the risk. Agents now understood these systems, and a single microphone had a way of turning a coffee meeting into a conspiracy count. While Chicago narrowed, a courtroom 2 states away dug up a chapter that had been an open secret for decades. Family secrets. A case built over years of work by agents and prosecutors brought a handful of older leaders and soldiers into a federal trial that laid out murders from the 1970s. A made man, shaken by decades of fear and by his own family's moral reckoning, cooperated in detail. He explained code words. He mapped crews. He took jurors into afternoons when decisions were made, and into evenings when those decisions were carried out. He spoke about the killing of a pair of brothers who had run wild in Las Vegas and then outlived their usefulness, about a businessman tied to the street who died on a highway, about a stack of other acts that had become the outfit's strictest form of discipline. He did not speak Accardo's name as someone who gave an order, because that had never been Accardo's style. What came through was something else. The sense that a code built and enforced during Accardo's chairmanship had created the climate in which those choices were made. The photographs offered at that trial looked like a time capsule. Cars with chrome and sharp angles, men in ties on summer nights, storefronts that had long since changed names. Names on the indictment included bosses who had been famous to detectives for years. One had eluded arrest for months, living in apartments and borrowed rooms before being picked up in a quiet alley. Another, who had once smiled for reporters, sat behind a table in a gray suit and watched as a former friend pointed at him from the witness chair. The jury listened to tapes in which coded talk about the work, cars, and helping with a matter suddenly made sense when matched with dates on morgue logs. It was a case that reached across the years and confirmed what insiders had known since the 1970s. The outfit's quiet period had not been free of violence. It had simply kept the blood out of the papers. In Nevada, long after the car bomb that almost killed the gambling wizard and the burials that ended the enforcer's run, the casinos had become corporations with no tolerance for whispers. Audits reached deeper than any boss sitting in Chicago's suburbs could have imagined in the 1960s. The Stardust and its sister property, once treated as wells that were skimmed with a steady hand, passed into clean management. The names Alan Glick and Frank Rosenthal stayed in books and movies, not on current ledgers. New hotels rose, bigger, flashier, owned by companies that issued quarterly reports. The old skim, that elegant theft before the count, was over. Accardo had known it would end in the 1980s. He had prepared. The men who outlived him managed around the edge, placing bets through locals, taking pieces of legal slot routes, leaning into sports wherever those laws were still gray. Looking back, law enforcement veterans have said the same thing about Tony Accardo. He understood how to turn criminal enterprises into habits. That may sound like praise. It is not. It is a clear-eyed assessment of harm. By making crime routine, he bent neighborhoods around the idea that cash moved best when it moved quietly. He made the bar owner accept that a machine paid for itself faster if it came with no paperwork and a handshake. He made a small contractor believe that a city inspection went smoother if a familiar face made a call before lunch. He made the numbers seller believe that 3 digits in a brown envelope were as normal as a lottery ticket. Those habits numb people. Numbness breeds acceptance. It took decades and a parade of indictments to break that spell in some corners. He also knew how to use legitimacy as a shield. Under his guidance, the outfit bought stakes in car dealerships, bakeries, laundries, concrete firms, waste companies, trucking outfits. Many of those were real businesses with real customers and honest workers. Mixed into their revenues were funds that cleaned money made elsewhere. He pressed for proper books and taxes paid on time, not because he cared about civic virtue, but because he knew audits end when papers look clean. He understood that a company with payroll and W-2s gave him an answer when a reporter yelled, "How do you make your money?" That answer, delivered in a courthouse doorway, would be monotone and plausible. It was enough to buy time. He used that time like a craftsman uses light. Long before the family secrets trial, one case had signaled the way the wind was blowing. Operation Strawman, built in the Midwest, used microphones in kitchens and back rooms to capture frank talk about casino counts, shares, and who was in for how much. It traced union pension loans to desert hotels, watched those hotels hire managers who took orders from men without licenses, and then tracked the quiet removal of cash before state tax inspectors arrived. When that case landed, it sent AUPA, Chicago's front boss, to federal prison alongside leaders from Kansas City and Milwaukee. A Cleveland figure, older and frail, cooperated at the last, putting his voice to a story agents had spent years assembling. The convictions closed a chapter. Accardo had helped open Teamster money into hotels, hotels into counting rooms into envelopes, headed back to Cicero. Accardo's style at meetings had always been short on drama. He sat still, listened, asked a plain question or two, and then nodded. He did not like arguments. He liked solutions. When two captains feuded, he found a line that allowed both to save face. When a crew took liberties, he shrank their territory until numbers improved. When a loud man made the papers, he was pushed out toward the edge. It was management, not myth. Men who had grown up on gangster stories sometimes found that disappointing. They expected a stage play. They got a boardroom. That boardroom, however, could make life hard for anyone who ignored its rules. He did not need to pound the table to make a point. The sign of power was the way a room quieted when he cleared his throat. The old wire service fight still belongs in any honest look at Accardo's career, because it shows how early he grasped the lever of information. In the 1930s and 40s, bookmakers across the country needed fast, reliable horse race results. A man named James Reagan ran the largest service. He resisted control. He was shot and later died, a case that stirred suspicions but never resolved in court against the men who wanted his network. What mattered for the outfit's future was the end point. Control over the flow of racing data fell into hands aligned with Chicago and its allies. That one victory multiplied profits for decades. It made local sports books predictable. It gave the outfit leverage over anyone who took wagers. It also delivered a lesson Accardo never forgot. Own the channel and you own the market. He was not a movie version of a kingpin. He kept his temper behind his teeth. He walked every day, often at times when his neighbors were asleep or at work, using those walks as moving meetings before the era of easy surveillance cameras. He rarely spoke on phones. When he did, he favored short calls and dull phrases. He preferred to pay skilled lawyers early rather than scramble after a problem. He used accountants who could sit across a table from IRS agents without sweating. He insisted that the men closest to him learn two skills before anything else: how to listen and how to shut up. His rules about drugs became part of his legend. He said no. He meant it. He had both moral and practical reasons. He saw narcotics as a trap for customers and a magnet for federal attention. He could read the headlines as well as anyone. New laws on conspiracy and continuing criminal enterprises were aimed at narcotics leaders and their networks. He did not want those weapons pointed his way. Still, even with his ban, younger men in the 1980s and 1990s saw easy money and gambled. Some did it quietly and escaped notice for a while. Some pulled their crews and their bosses into courtrooms when a wiretap caught the wrong words. The rule stood. The world had changed. He would have tightened it again if he had lived to see cell phones turn every careless sentence into a potential exhibit. His home life stayed simple even when his name became shorthand in newspapers. He lived in River Forest for years, then later in Barrington Hills. He liked order, shoes polished, ties straight, kitchen neat. He went to church. He wrote checks to local causes that passed envelopes to families in need. He did not boast in public. He was the neighbor who waved, the customer who tipped, the older man in a booth who left without saying much. That outward normalcy helped him survive. It also deepened the harm. People can forgive a bark easier than a whisper. A loud crook can be banished. A quiet one is harder to see and harder to stop. He did not live to watch the digital age rewrite the old games. Online betting would spread, first in corners, then openly when laws adjusted. Machines would evolve into devices that looked like games and argued they were for entertainment, not gambling. A subset of those would be legalized as video gaming terminals in Illinois years after he died, taxed and audited, but still echoing the coin routes he had controlled. Social media would turn minor figures into a spectacle he would have hated.
If he had been a decade younger, he might have designed a rule just for the new vanity that came with a camera in every pocket. No photos, no posts, no friends who act like reporters. Even after he passed, investigations kept dragging his era onto the page. Books came out with interviews from retired agents who had spent nights on stakeouts, freezing in cars while he made a 5-minute walk that told them nothing. Former prosecutors wrote about the shock of losing an appeal they had believed they would win. Journalists remembered knocking on his door and getting a polite nod and nothing else. Younger readers absorbed these stories and realized how long a city can run on 2 tracks, the official one with budgets and permits, and the shadow line with favors and cash and a phone call that unlocked a door without a key. Some tales refused to fade, like the break-in at his River Forest house in 1978. The burglars did not just steal, they ransacked, tearing up floors and furniture. The violation hit something beyond money for a man who had built his life around control. Men rumored to be involved in that burglary started turning up dead in the months that followed, found in lots and cars far from his block. No indictment carried his name. No testimony placed him in a room planning revenge. But the street wrote its own record, and that record said a line had been crossed and then enforced. Years later, detectives still talk about that string of bodies as the moment when even hard men lowered their voices when his name was
mentioned. Handra mentioned. The truth is that Accardo's reach came as much from what other people believed about him as from any directive he gave. There is power in a reputation for being patient and absolute. It makes men pay on time. It makes lawyers negotiate more carefully. It makes rivals think twice before trying something cute. That aura is not built overnight. It takes decades of never flinching in the small ways. Showing up, staying calm, never contradicting yourself, never needing a second warning to be understood. He built that aura without headlines. He kept it by treating every meeting like a job he could not afford to lose. Chicago learned to meet his shadow with small acts of courage. Some business owners refused routes and took the brunt of harassment. Some union members voted out stewards who had gone along with schemes for too long. Some officials stopped taking the call they had always taken. Some police and prosecutors kept pushing cases even after they lost the first round. Those choices did not erase the outfit. They did change how it worked. They turned a broad river into a set of smaller creeks. They made noise costly. They made routine harder. They opened the door for a younger generation to grow up without assuming that a back room ran everything. There is a lesson in the way Accardo lived and in the way his world adjusted after he was gone. Crime does not need a spotlight to spread. It thrives on habits, on small surrenders, on the lazy belief that this is how things are done. Undoing that belief takes the opposite kind of dedication, long, patient work that does not promise a headline. The agents who stuck microphones in restaurant ceilings, the prosecutors who learned to build cases from 100 dry exhibits, the honest stewards who refused to play along, the judges who ruled against men who had been friends of friends for years, they all pulled slowly at a net Accardo had woven. That is why the most important scenes in this story happen in quiet rooms, not in alleys or on big stages. He never wrote a memoir. He never sat for a long interview. He left no public explanation. What we have are the records of courts, the recollections of people who worked for him, the reports agents wrote late at night, and the way the city's map still looks when you squint. We know he began as a teenager on the fringes of Capone's world. We know he rose under Ricca and Nicky as the outfit moved from bootlegging to rackets that fit peacetime, gambling, labor, and quiet control. We know he oversaw a system that reached into Hollywood in the 1940s and into Las Vegas in the 1970s. We know he made his home look like any other family's while an empire hummed around it. We know he died at home, old and free, a rare end in his line of work. If you stand on a Chicago sidewalk on a cold night and listen to the L far away, it is easy to imagine how his quiet felt like power. Doors open, people lower their eyes, meals pause, then everything returns to normal. Because normal, in his city, learned to bend around him. He shaped that normal with envelopes, whispered rules, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He did not do it alone. He had help from men who brought schemes and strength to the table. He had help from officials who pretended to see nothing. He had help from habits that looked harmless until you added them up. He is gone. The city remains. The outfit remains. Smaller, older, less flashy, but stamped by the method he left behind. You can see it in the way successors handle bookmaking without making the sports page, in the way they invest in dull businesses that never run out of customers, in the way they keep their faces out of cameras. You can see it in how long some cases still take to build, and in how careful investigators have become about walking into restaurants that once felt like fortresses. He would have liked that. Not the investigations, but the quiet. He believed quiet was everything. He believed that if you could turn your life into a steady line, no big arcs, no sudden dips, you could stand longer than the loud men. He proved it. He took a city that already had a talent for secrets and made those secrets into a structure. He built rules that made criminal work feel like office work. He taught men that the safest way to be dangerous was to look ordinary. That is not romance. It is a cold fact. And it is why decades after his funeral, people still tell his story in low tones, late at night, with an eye on the door. In the years after Family Secrets, Chicago kept telling on itself. New cases looked backward and forward at once. Old wounds were named in court. New schemes were exposed. None of it gave us the single scene some storytellers want, the moment when a hero walks in and cleans a city. That is not how cities work. Cities change by inches. They recover in the same way they were bent through routines. That means you can stand on that same sidewalk where the L rattles and think about a man who learned to be invisible, and then think about all the people who learned to see. What remains to say about him is not an ending but a frame. He was the most successful practitioner of a certain method in a certain place. He made himself small and his reach large. He made crimes look like chores. He traded sparkle for duration and got what he wanted: wealth, control, insulation, and time. He paid for all. He lived a long time in a world that rarely lets anyone keep all three prizes: money, control, and freedom. His last prize outlived him. After he was gone, the city kept moving, but the lines he had drawn stayed on the map. Men who had learned under him still preferred booths to back rooms, parks to hallways, early walks to phone calls. Taxis still dropped certain faces near certain doors. Bar owners still nodded when route men rolled in a machine. Inspectors still had calendars that seemed to match the moods of clubs and card rooms. None of that appeared in neon. It never had. That was his signature, and it did not fade with his name in an obituary. He started with the 42, left school early, and carried messages when liquor was the business of the hour. He kept his voice low, his eyes open, and his steps steady. Men above him noticed that calm. He earned a blunt nickname after a brutal episode under Capone, a label he never wore out loud. He learned bookkeeping by watching envelopes rise through a pyramid. He watched older bosses fall to taxes or to bursts of panic. He took notes when Nicky chose death rather than surrender to an indictment tied to a Hollywood shakedown. He watched Ricca adjust the machine after that scandal and saw how leverage over unions and studios could change a city far from a film lot. He kept learning, then waited, then stepped into a chair not by declaring himself boss, but by making himself the one person no one could ignore. The movie case mattered because it showed how far Chicago was willing to reach when the payoff promised both cash and control. A Los Angeles fixer smoothed introductions in studio offices. Union men with influence over projectionists and crew schedules asked for fees in the name of peace. Studios paid to avoid strikes and delays. Then things broke. Two insiders flipped, one a union figure on the take, one a lieutenant with connections on both coasts. Their testimony sent Ricca and others to federal prison in the mid-1940s. Nicky took his own life rather than face trial. When the cell doors closed, the quiet man from the West Side did what he always did. He filled gaps without drawing attention. He became the anchor. Paper rarely put his name in bold. The men who mattered did. He learned early that information was a commodity. In the years when horse tracks ran America's favorite bet, the wire service that carried results was the bloodstream of bookmaking. A Chicago-aligned push took control of that stream after an independent operator was ambushed and later died. Court proof evaporated as usual, but the practical outcome was clear. Odds and results now moved at the pleasure of the outfit and its partners. That one victory multiplied earnings at every level. It also left a scar on the city's memory. Defiance drew a price, and market dominance came not just from muscle but from managing the pipes. Prohibition ended. Money did not. He stood in rooms where slot machines hummed and cards slapped felt while front windows advertised sandwiches. He steadily pushed the outfit out of neighborhoods where random violence raised alarms and into suburban enclaves where pliant officials made life easy. He invested through fronts in bakeries, car lots, laundries, concrete, waste hauling, and trucking. Some of those firms were honest and profitable on their own. Some mixed streams until no one could sort clean from dirty. All served a purpose: to make the answer to "what do you do" sound like something you could tell a neighbor without blinking. Hearings under bright lights arrived in the 1950s. A senator took the country on a tour of vice. TV cameras beamed faces into living rooms. He showed up when subpoenaed and said almost nothing, invoking rights that spared him from giving the government a free story. It was the same method he would use when asked about taxes. He did not pick fights. He did not perform. He sat, silent, behind lawyers who argued technical points and cried foul over sloppy audits. A jury once believed the government enough to vote guilty on a tax case. An appellate court later wiped that verdict, scolding the way proof had been assembled. Years later, another attempt sputtered. He treated every courtroom like a lecture on patience. Most men in his business never got to offer that lesson twice. He did. His rise inside the outfit looked from outside, like a shadow. He moved from a trusted pair of hands to the man who set rules. He let others host. That was part of a durable design. He made the front boss a role, not a throne, and he kept the real power in quiet places. Sam Giancana carried the showman's torch for a time. He enjoyed nights surrounded by music and actors. He visited a Lake Tahoe resort that a famous singer had invested in and triggered a regulatory storm when his face showed up near cameras. Licensing boards killed the singer's gaming credential to send a message: celebrity cannot excuse band company. The chairman hated that kind of noise. He tolerated Giancana until the attention started burning money, then made the call every leader has to make when a strong personality threatens the brand. The front man left for Mexico. The city did not even skip a beat. He liked steady income more than any single score. The numbers game put small bets in envelopes all week. Bookmaking tied to horse tracks and sports paid a reliable cut. Route machines loaded with coins turned taverns into quiet partners. Loans came fast, and at rates that kept borrowers paying long after they had replaced the broken freezer that drove them to ask for help. Union leverage could bend a city's schedule. Who unloaded at docks? Who poured on a site? Who set up a trade show? Those levers reached into airports and municipal projects, where subcontracts spread like vines and everyone took a bite. He ran all of it with two rules that never changed. Don't be greedy. Avoid attention. The 1960s brought a law that changed the game. RICO allowed prosecutors to argue that a man who directed a pattern of racketeering could be as guilty as the man who took the money or swung the bat. He understood. He had always believed distance was safety. Now the law aimed to erase distance. He adapted again. He spoke even less. He kept records in other people's hands. He turned the front office into a revolving door. Sam Battaglia, then Felix Aldericio, then Joseph Ayupa. When one fell to prison or illness, another stepped into the chair. The chairman stayed in the second row, steady, unruffled, the final word everyone listened for even when someone else held the title. The desert called. Teamsters pension loans funded hotels with sparkling facades. An executive from San Diego took control on paper through a corporation that would become a conduit. A brilliant casino mind, blacklisted by regulators, effectively ran floors without a license, setting policy and odds from a seat with a view of the pit. A Chicago enforcer managed street issues and built a side crew of burglars who treated jewelry stores and private homes like bank vaults. Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland each owned a chair in the room. From counting cages, small slices traveled east before they ever hit official ledgers. That skim, measured and quiet, fit the chairman's taste. Then men forgot the rules. The casino mind grew famous and defied the blacklist. A bomb blew the bottom out of his car. He lived, then left town. The enforcer's side crew ran loud and eventually crumbled. The chairman watched his machine drift toward the tabloid style he had spent a life avoiding, then started tightening screws. As the 1970s closed, a burglary ripped through the quiet he guarded at home. His River Forest house was ransacked. Floors were ripped up, drawers dumped. The violation bit deeper than the dollars lost. In the months that followed, several men rumored to have been part of that break-in turned up dead in different places around the region. Police wrote case numbers. Columnists wrote about lines you do not cross. The chairman never spoke about it. He did not need to. By year's end, a lesson hung in the air. He would absorb almost anything as long as it did not touch his family. Touch that, and the room went cold. The 1980s turned what had been murmurs into indictments. A microphone hidden in a Kansas City restaurant recorded casual talk about casino counts and shares. Another device in a kitchen captured complaints about deliveries and partners who were taking more than their cut. Those tapes, paired with travel records and ledger sheets, carried cases into courtrooms in the Midwest. Ayupa, The Cicero boss who kept suburbs humming for years went to federal prison. Partners in other cities followed. A Cleveland elder broke ranks and cooperated. The skim ended. Nevada tightened. Corporate managers with clean resumes took over properties. Auditors dug deep. The old trick with envelopes died under fluorescent lights and spreadsheets. At the same time, another front burned down. A powerful ward that had long served as the bridge between City Hall and street crews collapsed under a federal probe. A defense lawyer who had grown rich trading favors agreed to wear a wire. His recordings captured bribe talks and schedule fixing with judges and aldermen. The ward's alderman went to prison. The ward's silent boss died before facing a jury. That collapse cut off one of the outfit's favorite hallways. The chairman had never relied on one hallway. He had built many. Still, even he felt that floor tilt. The Teamsters' world darkened too. Alan Dorfman, a longtime power broker in the pension fund, and a man who knew the inside of every major loan to a Nevada property the outfit touched, was convicted of bribery in 19 weeks later. He was shot dead in a suburban parking lot. The killing, never solved in court, looked to many like a preemptive strike to keep him from becoming a government witness. His death signaled to every captain that a reliable spigot would stay shut. Pension loans would no longer flow on friendly phone calls. Oversight arrived with appointments and rules, the kind that cannot be waved away with a handshake. After the enforcer in Las Vegas wore out his welcome and pulled too much heat, a decision was made, and in 1986 the brothers were killed and buried in an Indiana field. Later testimony in a large case suggested that the move had been approved at the highest level. No one said the chairman ordered it because people in that room did not speak that way about him. They said the leadership understood and consented. The message was what mattered. Discipline first, noise last. He grew older. He moved from River Forest to a larger home in Barrington Hills. He still wore suits with narrow stripes and laced shoes to a shine. He took quiet meals and kept an eye on the door. He continued to select frontmen the way a chairman picks CEOs, not princes. Ferriola took the front office for a period, profit-minded and careful before illness ended his run. Sam Carlisi stepped in during the early 1990s. Rocco Infelici held pieces. These men managed a leaner map, found margin in gray market machines, kept sports books running with pagers and payphones, and pulled steady rent from waste hauling, warehousing, and construction. He died in 1992 at home. Obituaries folded decades into simple lines. Reporters used the same photographs they had used for years. The fishing shot that earned him big tuna, a courthouse doorway with a felt hat, a half smile under harsh light. Agents who had chased him for a career offered quotes that felt like shrugging admiration without praise. The hardest part of our job was that he never raised his voice and never left a fingerprint. Lawyers said what they had always said: rights matter. Rumor isn't proof. Neighbors remembered a polite gentleman who watered his lawn. That was the double life, not as contradiction but as design. After he was gone, courts reopened his time through a different door. Family secrets arrived in the 2000s. A made man who had carried out assignments for years chose to cooperate. His decision came after a mistake left DNA on a glove dropped at the scene of an ambush. He faced a future in a federal cell, and a conscience that had been pushed for decades by a brother's memory and by his own son's questions. He walked into a room and told the story. In court, he explained who had met where, how lists were made, how a signal could be a word or a look. He put names to murders from the 1970s, a businessman tied to Teamsters Insurance who had been shot in the mid-1970s, a soldier who had helped with the wrong job and was eliminated days later when leadership feared he might talk. The Spilotro brothers brought back to the Midwest and killed after Las Vegas became a storm, others whose deaths had long been whispered about in diner booths. He mapped crews and described a system where the chairman's rules set the tone even when he did not voice the final command. The trial ended with convictions of bosses who had seemed untouchable: a street boss caught after months on the run, a consigliere known for jokes, a crew chief who had been feared on the South Side for years, a former Chicago cop who fed information to the outfit and kept files moving in the wrong direction. The judge handed down heavy sentences. The city watched a curtain pulled back on acts that had been whispered about since the Nixon years. Those verdicts did not erase the machine. They did change its size and shape. The outfit became smaller, older, quieter still. New revenue came in increments. Sports gambling remained a steady spigot in neighborhoods where trust held. Gray machines grew into a legal industry once the state sanctioned video gaming terminals decades after he died. Some of the same routes, now taxed and audited, still sat in the same corners of the same taverns, humming under state stickers instead of under the radar. Union leverage persisted in areas where timing still mattered: loading docks, concrete pours, stage crews, although more eyes watched than ever. The old First Ward style of politics no longer brokered deals at a single table. Power dispersed, which made some schemes harder to run and some easier to hide. People sometimes ask why he avoided prison when others did not. The answer lives in habits. He delegated, he avoided phones, he paid for good counsel before problems ripened. He stuck to businesses that blended into ordinary life. He never chased fame. That last point is not trivial. Fame is the trap. Giancana touched it and lost his seat. A gambling savant in Las Vegas tasted it and drew a bomb. An enforcer took it and wound up in the ground. The chairman outlasted them by choosing routine over rush, paper over speeches, and a lawn to water over a spotlight to stand under. He also built redundancy into every scheme. When a ward fell, he had another route. When one union local cleaned house, he spoke to a different steward. When a judge retired, he had a lawyer who could find another courtroom. When a property in Nevada turned corporate, he looked to legal riverboats in the Midwest and kept his sports people on their feet. He lived like a man who expected storms. Storms came. He did not stand under trees. There are threads people like to pull that do not lead to him directly, but run through his era. One is the disappearance of a former Teamsters president in 1975, a case that still fills documentaries. While that drama belonged to Detroit's orbit, Chicago's stake in the Union meant its leaders followed every turn. Another is the 1976 killing of a Los Angeles and Las Vegas fixer who had served as a bridge between Hollywood and Midwestern bosses in the 1940s and later became involved in shadowy foreign plots. He was found dead out west, another unsolved case that points at many doors. These stories remind you that the outfit he shaped did not live in a Chicago-only jar. It sent out roots, and sometimes those roots touched people who had national headlines on their own before the first handshake. He held fast to a rule about narcotics. He said no. Others in newer outfits elsewhere made fortunes on powder and paid with prison or worse. In Chicago, some younger crews tried to break the rule, especially in the 1980s when cocaine washed over city lines like a tide. A few captains looked away, thinking the distance would protect them. The distance did not hold. Wiretaps built around drug rings caught voices used to talking about gambling and loans. Cases that began with narcotics counts morphed into racketeering charts with familiar names in small boxes. The chairman's old reason for the ban looked prophetic. Drugs invite heat that spreads to every name on a list, not just the one carrying the package. His life left behind simple images that tell a larger story. River forest sidewalks, Barrington Hills quiet, a chair by a window with a folded paper on a table, a weathered face that seemed unmoved by either praise or insult, shoes polished to a shine, suits pressed, a hat on a winter day. He looked like a retiree. He acted like a chairman. When he entered a room, conversations lowered not because he demanded silence, but because people learned his language. We'll see. A nod, a glance at a watch. That was how millions changed hands, and how decisions that bent lives were made. The harm hides in that calm. If you expect a shout to warn you, you will miss the whisper that reaches further. He did not invent the outfit. He refined it. He reduced the blood on the sidewalk by spreading fear in other ways. He took a machine built by Capone, loud, messy, fiery, and turned it into a bureaucracy, cruel and efficient. That bureaucratic turn made money while burrowing into places that should never have felt normal for men like him. School fundraisers, church basements, car lots, warehouse floors. He gave people who wanted to look away every excuse to look away. It took decades of work by cops, squads, journalists, honest stewards, and voters to force those eyes open. If you ask what his story teaches, there are a few clean answers. 1. Power often hides and lasts longer when it hides. 2. Institutions can be bent not just by violence but by routine. 3. Laws change but habits outlast statutes unless someone stands every day to break them. 4. Egos write indictments. Discipline writes checks that clear. 5. You can measure the reach of a quiet man by the number of loud men who fall around him. His crimes hurt people up close. A shop owner who borrowed to fix a roof and never got free. A bartender who split a machine take and paid cash back to middlemen because it was easier than arguing. A teamster who saw his pension used to build hotels that sent hidden cash to rooms 1,000 miles away.
A contractor who covered a bribe in a bid and watched a project get approved while better offers failed. A city resident who trusted courts and learned how easily a guilty verdict could be turned, or a bench trial tilted, at least for a stretch before a federal probe cleaned house. Add those stories up and you see not a character from a film but a manager of harm. He also made choices that kept him out of prison when other leaders paid. He refused televisions in rooms where he met if he did not control the plug. He used the same barber and watched who sat down while his hair was cut. He bought groceries with cash. He slowed to let cars pass, then turned. He preferred seats with a view. These are not cinematic flourishes, they are pieces of a system that turned human error into the government's best hope, and turned the absence of error into a shield. The coda to his life does not end with a raid or a triumph. It ends with a city that now knows how to see. Operation Greylord taught Chicago that even judges can be corrupted, and even judges can be caught. Operation Gambat taught the city that a ward once treated as untouchable could be opened like a book. Family Secrets taught the city that the truth can come from the most unexpected mouth. A man who had done terrible things and still found a way to tell a jury how a machine worked. Those cases were not chapters in his own prosecution. He had died. They were chapters in the prosecution of his legacy. If you walk down a block he once knew and look carefully, you can still find traces. A social club, now a cafe. A bar with a corner where a machine once sat. A warehouse that used to belong to a firm tied to a cousin who signed checks for a concrete pour. The city built over much of it. New towers went up. New teams won. New families moved in and made neighborhoods their own. Yet the story still lives in police notebooks and family tales told at kitchen tables. It lives in the way older residents smile a little when a younger one says, "That doesn't happen here." They say it did. And then they tell a story about a man who never raised his voice and yet ended up setting a code people followed without being told out loud. He held that code together with small rituals. He paid attention to shoes. He learned names and remembered them. He tipped in a way that made people feel seen. He returned calls only when it mattered. He had patience that could starve a rival. He had a quiet that could crowd a room. Those are not mystical traits. They are human ones, trained and disciplined and bent toward a purpose that took from others to fill his ledger and protect his own. In the end, you are left with a contrast. A man who sat in a neat kitchen, wiped crumbs from a table, buttoned a cuff, and then made decisions that sent money flowing, and sometimes people running. A grandfather who watered a lawn, and a strategist who kept a city's shadow economy on time. Those who loved him remember the first man. Those who chased him remember the second. Those who lost to his machine remember the absence of both in the moment they needed help and found only the rules he wrote. He did not confess. He did not explain. He did not apologize. He did what he believed he had to do to stay free in a business that chews up most men by 50. He watched friends die behind bars and behind buildings. He watched prosecutors age out before they got the case they wanted. He watched reporters retire with notebooks full of hints and no single quote that would hold a headline. He watched younger bosses fall to attention they could not resist. He made it to an old man's chair and left from that chair without a scene. In his world, that was the best ending available. It was not just a personal achievement. It was the proof that his method worked. But it worked only as long as a city allowed it. Chicago learned, slowly and then faster, to say no. It did not happen with a single election or a single arrest. It happened when people did boring, brave things. Voted out a corrupt steward, wrote a check to a candidate who wasn't tied in, called a hotline when they saw a bag exchanged, testified even when it meant losing a friend, audited every line, insisted that a permit should be won, not bought. It happened because a teenager who grew up in a neighborhood where the numbers game had been part of the wallpaper went to law school and later signed a warrant with a steady hand. We remember him not to romanticize him but to describe how harm can look ordinary and how ordinary can be dangerous when it organizes itself. He made undesirable acts look like administration. He made open theft look like budgeting. He made violence rare but implied. He made rules that turned nights into schedules and schedules into a net. He made choices that ensured his evenings were quiet. Thousands of others paid for those evenings with worry, with debt, with lost faith in fair play. That bill is the one that history ought to read out loud when it says his name. Now the house is gone to other families. The booth is occupied by strangers who eat and laugh without reading the door the way he did. The routes still exist, but invoices print from small machines with real numbers on them. Casinos issue earnings calls. Unions hold elections under watch. Sports books operate under state law. Books about him sit on shelves. Old tapes play in classrooms where future lawyers and reporters hear the slow hum of a microphone above a table and try to imagine the patience it took to make that tape and to win with it. The city still loves a story, but it loves its reflection in the lake more. Close your eyes and picture that quiet man walking past a diner window on a winter evening. Snow stacks against the curb. A train rumbles overhead. He does not wave. He does not stop. He leaves a wake without moving faster than anyone else. The door closes and conversations pick up again. That is the image that will outlast every headline. Power without spectacle. Control without noise. Hurt without drama. A life that shows how the absence of a scene can be the scene, and how the hardest thing to fight is not the man who shouts, but the one who never needs to. His story ends with a city that learned to listen for whispers, to read ledgers, to watch corners, to expect discipline not just from rogues but from itself. It ends with descendants who will know him only through two kinds of tales: the family version, all dinners and holidays, and the civic version, all investigations and courtrooms. Somewhere between those two lies the truth about a person who made a choice about what mattered to him, and held to it so completely that decades later we still have to argue with the lullaby of his method. In that argument lives the lesson worth taking to bed tonight. The most durable influence rarely dresses itself up. It moves like snow, quiet, steady, reshaping streets a grain at a time. He moved that way, for better for him and worse for many others. To keep a city honest, you have to notice the snow while it is still falling, not just shovel after it drifts. You have to question routines. You have to prize clarity. You have to refuse to lower your eyes when a calm man enters the room. And you have to remember that the point of telling this story is not to give him more shadow, but to give everyone else more light.